This program is brought to you by the Practicing Law Institute, a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys, professionals, and accountants at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.
One of the most talked about television shows in the securities enforcement world over the past decade, Showtime's Billions follows hedge fund titan Bobby Axelrod and the team of prosecutors set out to investigate him, led by Chuck Rhoades. To kick off our discussion of the show on today's episode, we are bringing you a table read from the pilot episode of the series, featuring Chuck's negotiations with a convicted inside trader that features a surprise guest. Library, U.S. Attorney's Office. Chuck enters. It's an imposing setting for a meeting. Law books, case studies, 100-year-old leather chairs. Two men await him. They stand as he enters. One, Skip Wolkowska, is mid-50s, a little sheepish, despite a $10,000 suit and haircut to match. The other is his short, bald attorney. Then a third man, older, facing the other way, stands. Chuck's eyes immediately go to the older man, who is late 60s and hasn't had a sheepish moment in his life.
Thank you for agreeing to see us.
What the are you doing here, Dad? Trying to get me disbarred?
The older man, Charles Rhoades Sr., does not look cowed.
Christ, you're more dramatic than your mother.
Some men would be cut by this. Chuck laughs. Chuck Sr. does too. The attorney does not.
We're not breaking any rules or regulations. Mr. Rhoades is not being compensated to appear with us.
I know how careful he is, and why you brought him. But believe me, it's already backfired.
Hear us out, Chuck. Skip knows he did wrong.
Now that he's been convicted, he knows. But when he had the chance to settle...
That's in the past. Right now, we're trying to set up a situation that will allow Skip to demonstrate his reformation and for him to contribute to society.
By what? Let me guess. My office allowing him to keep some small portion of his ill-gotten gains? $5 million?
We were going to ask for 10.
Which represents a fraction of the...
Chuck glances to Wolkowska.
Uh-huh. And that way, without having to worry about supporting yourself upon leaving prison, you could get right to doing charitable works and warning your buddies about the pitfalls of being a bad actor.
Exactly.
That sounds reasonable. It's the type of deal that's been made in this library countless times.
Wolkowska gets hopeful, trades a look with Senior.
By my predecessors, but not by me.
Chuck turns to Wolkowska.
You thought bringing my father would afford you some kind of courtesy.
Not at all, no.
But you miscalculated. Badly. Instead of using my father, you should have emulated him and built your fortune without f***ing up. You didn't. So your cronies are going to see that they better not trade on inside information or abuse their positions, or they'll end up like you. Broke. Humiliated. Which is why you'll be closer to 10 cents than 10 million when I'm done with you.
Wolkowska begins to cry.
I'm not prepared for this. I can't. Please, Chuck. This was about leniency. Have some mercy.
When Chuck answers, he looks directly at Charles Sr.
My father always taught me that mercy was a word used when they couldn't take the pain.
Wolkowska absorbs it. Senior shakes his head.
Maybe I taught you too well.
I love you, Dad. But if you walk into my office and try to use your influence again, you'll walk out of here in handcuffs.
Then Chuck turns to Wolkowska and softens his tone.
Mr. Wolkowska, I've known many men in your position, and I can tell that you have the strength to get through it and come out on the other side a better man. I wish you well. You can see yourselves out.
And scene. We couldn't resist the go at acting after finding a rough draft of the script for the pilot online. and many might wonder how Billions gets it right when it comes to the nuance and specificity of securities issues. In fact, the show utilizes an expert consultant during production and while filming on set to help make sense of thorny legal aspects that arise in Chuck Rhoades' pursuit of Bobby Axelrod. We're lucky to be joined by that expert today on Insecurities. I think that was a great read. Anybody want to go back and do it again? Hello, and welcome to the Insecurities Podcast, helping you stay current on the latest securities, regulatory, and enforcement developments with a practitioner's perspective on the stories you should be following. As always, I'm Chris Eckimoff, and I'm here with my co-host, Kurt Wolf.
It's good to be with you, Chris. All right. So as we mentioned up top, we are fortunate to have with us a consultant from the hit drama Billions. As you may know, Billions is a show all about a hedge fund manager and the prosecutors that pursue him. And in order for that story to make sense, the writers have to do some research. And so they have hired a consultant to help them with the show to make sure that it makes sense and is accessible to all the viewers at home. We have that gentleman with us today. His name is David Miller. David is currently a shareholder at the law firm Greenberg Traurig, where his practice focuses on white-collar criminal defense, securities and commodities enforcement, and cryptocurrency, cybersecurity, anti-money laundering, and national security matters. David previously served for 5 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, where he was a member of the Securities and Commodities Fraud Task Force. He also served as a terrorism prosecutor with DOJ in Washington, D.C., as a special assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, and as an assistant general counsel for the CIA. In those roles, David handled many high-profile white-collar, insider trading, offering fraud, Ponzi schemes, valuation fraud, and accounting fraud prosecutions. Among other things, he was part of the SDNY's Operation Perfect Hedge, which secured more than 80 insider trading convictions. David also prosecuted several high-profile terrorism cases, and when he was at CIA, was the CIA legal representative to the prosecution team in the Scooter Libby case. Now, among his other responsibilities, David is a technical advisor for the popular Showtime series Billions. And rumor has it, he's even appeared as an extra in several episodes. David, we are thrilled to have you with us. Welcome to Insecurities.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, David, we've been excited for this episode for a long time. Kurt and I are both, appointment viewers of Billions and appreciate your work. Although I have to say, I cannot recall you as an extra, but on a rewatch, we'll be sure to highlight those scenes for our viewers. And we're excited, really excited to talk about the show today, as well as, your storied career. Kurt did a great job profiling that up top. But for fans of the show Billions, we've got bad news. We will not be sharing any spoilers or unaired plot lines in the upcoming seasons.
No way.
Yeah.
If you thought NDAs in the legal world were tight, I think Hollywood has the one up on that. So we'll be sure to toe the line appropriately. But to kick us off, David, we want to talk about a lot of the roles that you've served in. You've been a prosecutor in Washington as well as the so-called Sovereign District. That's the Southern District of New York, and that gets into kind of that connection to the television series. But you've come on to Billions and consulted beginning with season 2 up through and the current seasons, both in the can and in production. So we'll talk a bit about your role there and some of our more favorite moments of those seasons that have already aired. And then finally, we're going to pepper you with some questions about the show in our lightning round based on your experience and maybe some of your preferences related to the conduct and the characters on the show. So we hope, David, you're excited as we are for today's episode.
Absolutely. Very excited again. Thanks for having me.
You got it. So, NYU law and came right out of school and got into private practice for the first few years of your career. But as Kurt mentioned, you've served in a couple of interesting governmental roles. So what had you make the jump from private practice to government service back in 2005 when you joined up with the CIA?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as you noted, when I left NYU Law School, I actually worked for 2 different law firms. First, the now defunct law firm of Dewey Ballantyne, and then I went to a mid-sized firm that merged into a Melviny and Myers. Starting after 9/11, I started thinking more about public service. and what I could do, with my background and skill set to try to step up and do something for the country. I had always sort of been interested in the Central Intelligence Agency for a variety of reasons, and ultimately went through a full application process. And as anybody who can tell you who's been through the CIA application process, it is not brief and it is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
I can't imagine.
Anyway, so that's what motivated me to as I said, to get involved in public service, and ultimately got the appointment at CIA and moved down to Washington at the beginning of 2005, right at the beginning of President Bush's second term, and worked for the agency beginning in March of 2005.
And you served in dual roles as well, if that's correct. Also in the Eastern District of Virginia as an assistant U.S. attorney. So it seems like you've got a lot of interesting stories from back in the mid 2000s. You touched on 9/11, and a lot of the focus in that time period was on terrorism or anti-terrorism issues and the global war on terror going on at that point. But you also got to play a role in terms of one of the more headline trials of the time, the Scooter Libby case. We don't want you to disclose anything confidential, but talk to us about some of the issues that you were dealing with in your dual roles back during that time period.
Sure, happy to do that. So when I joined CIA, I basically was responsible for handling the agency's civil and criminal litigation docket, along with other lawyers that were in the Office of General Counsel, and also was staffed on matters relating to the global war on terror. Because of my litigation background, the agency was sort of looking to get closer relationships with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia, and that U.S. Attorney's Office, also known as the Rocket Docket, occasionally brings in people from other federal agencies to act as special assistant U.S. attorneys. I was selected through a consultation process to be one of those special AUSAs, and ultimately got designated as a special AUSA at EDVA. And this sort of enhanced the relationship between CIA and the U.S. Attorney's Office at a time when there were a number of terrorism prosecutions going on through EDVA, including those that implicated CIA information or other equities. Ultimately, after about a year, went back full-time to CIA, but at that point, the Scooter Libby case was starting to heat up. As you may all recall, the special prosecutor for the Scooter Libby case was Patrick Fitzgerald, who was charged with investigating whether or not the identity of a former CIA officer undercover, Valerie Plame, had been disclosed intentionally. And so there was a criminal investigation. This ultimately culminated in charges against Mr. Libby, who had been chief of staff and principal national security advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney for essentially making false statements to the FBI and committing perjury before the grand jury. Those were the allegations in the indictment. The reason why there was a CIA representative, ultimately, namely me, to the Scooter Libby team and ultimate trial was because, number one, there were CIA witnesses that were implicated in the case and ultimately who testified at trial. But number two, and frankly more importantly, Mr. Libby's primary defense was what was termed a preoccupation defense. Mr. Libby had been charged with intentionally lying before the grand jury, intentionally lying to federal investigators, which are felonies. And his defense was, listen, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't intend to lie because I was so preoccupied with these most important national security matters. And so I should be able to tell the jury at trial what were the most critical national security secrets facing the country during that 2-3 year period, particularly right after 9/11. And thus, Mr. Libby put into play some of the most critical secrets this country, frankly, has. And that prompted litigation under what's called the Classified Information Procedures Act, or CIPA, which is a procedural mechanism to deal with classified information in criminal cases, federal criminal cases. My role was to act as the intelligence community and White House coordinator for all the national security information that was being put into play, and to work with the special counsel with respect to the litigation and the briefs and declarations, et cetera, that were part of the filings that went to the court and were highly top secret during that CIPA, or Classified Information Procedures Act, process. We went forward to trial, and again, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I worked with the special counsel team and dealing with CIA witnesses who needed to testify, as well as other witnesses within the national security establishment that needed to testify. After that trial, I was hooked and wanted to be a prosecutor full time after my experiences with that and with the Eastern District of Virginia. And it's a long story, but I wound up getting a position over as a terrorism prosecutor at the Department of Justice in Washington. And for the next couple of years, prosecuted and tried high-profile terrorism cases around the country, including the first homegrown terror cell to be prosecuted in the United States. And then also I worked with prosecutors at a U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., to prosecute the first Iraqi insurgent to be prosecuted in federal court. And then after doing that for about 2 years, applied for and got a position with the, as you termed, Sovereign District of New York, commonly known as the Southern District of New York.
It seems like you only work in jurisdictions with nicknames, David.
Apparently so. And then moved back up to New York, and you sort of went through my experience in SDNY, but I worked on a number of cases there, including several high-profile white-collar cases involving insider trading, offering fraud, Ponzi schemes, valuation fraud cases like involved in the London Whale case and the Michael Balboa case, a number of accounting fraud cases, including a large prosecution involving a company named Vitesse, insider trading cases with respect to expert networks, as you mentioned, Operation Perfect Hedge. And I also worked on a number of international narcotics and national security matters. And then after about a little over 5 years and spending most of my time in the Securities and Commodities Fraud Unit there, I wound up taking a partnership position at another firm. And then about a year and a half ago, joined Greenberg Traurig.
David, you've had a fascinating career, and I think you are sort of uniquely positioned perhaps to consult on shows like Billions. I know you've done some consulting work on other shows as well, but because you've sort of covered the landscape in terms of your experience at CIA as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York and in private practice, you really are an expert for a show to go to make sure that they're getting it right. So what we would like to do is pivot and talk to you a little bit about how your experience informs your work on the show Billions. So why don't you start by telling us how did you come to be the technical advisor for the show, and what exactly does that job entail?
It's an interesting question. In or around, I think it was March of 2016, and I got an email out of the blue from one of the assistants on the show saying they wanted to chat with me and could I give them a call and set up a meeting. I actually thought that it was a prank, and I've told the showrunners this before, because my friends and I at the Southern District would occasionally play elaborate pranks on each other, and unfortunately I had been on the receiving end of one of the larger ones. So I thought this was in the vein of a continuation of pranks on David Miller. I was on a plane and I was getting this email through the Wi-Fi. When I got off the plane, I called this person, and I had Googled her and noticed she had an IMDb page, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. I have an IMDb page now and it means nothing. And so I called and spoke with her, and she said, yeah, we want to, chat with you and just get a little bit of background information, and maybe you can chat with the showrunners and the writers. And I said, sure. And I still was skeptical and thought it was a prank. Set up a time to go down the following Friday, I think it was, to their offices in the West Village. And I guess when I wrote down the address, I transposed the address numbers on for the street address. And I show up and I'm looking at a bombed out building. And I remember standing there as I was cursing the names of certain friends of mine from the Southern District who I thought was behind this. And then realizing, well, wait a minute, maybe I transpose the numbers, and I look across the street, and sure enough, there's an office building there, and I go, and there's a production company, and I go up, and I'm like, okay, I should probably take this seriously. And sure enough, I walk in, and the showrunners are there, and the writers are there, Brian Koppelman, David Levine, and everybody else. And we talked for a couple hours, and I told them about some of my cases and some of the stories that I had and things that I had done while I had been at the U.S. Attorney's Office and in government generally. And we all got along very well. And when the meeting was over on the way out, Brian and David came up to me and they said they wanted to offer me a job as a technical advisor for the show. And that was it.
Oh man, I have a great prank planned for Kurt now. I won't tell you what it's about, but it might follow a similar fact pattern.
I'll be on the lookout.
Yeah, so as technical advisor, David, what do you do on set? You just hang out with movie stars all day, or what are they what are they
Yeah,
asking you to do there?
it's tough work. It's tough work. No, I have a variety of different roles. Certainly I speak with and work with the writers and the showrunners in answering legal questions because I will tell you, they are very interested in getting this right and getting it accurate. Okay, and they work very hard to do so. Obviously, there's a storyline and there's a drama and there's only 50 some odd minutes per episode, and frankly, some of what we do as prosecutors and defense lawyers is pretty boring. So certainly people wouldn't want to be seeing that aspect on TV. But nevertheless, they want to get it right. I've really been quite impressed by that. And that also translates over into the writing staff, a number of whom are amazing people, and some of whom are actually lawyers as well. And so I work with them in discussing, so what the legal issues are in the framework of the storyline ideas that they have. I talk to them about my old cases. I answer questions about particular legal theories and sort of arcs that they have. Sometimes I also even make suggestions about stuff and come up with ideas for various aspects of sort of the legal plot line that they're developing. I then will get outlines and scripts and we'll review those and we'll provide thoughts about, particular legal issues. Look, again, I sort of recognize, and it's like working with any other client because I consider them to be a very important client, right? And I know that sometimes, as lawyers, we might want to sort of say, well, you should always do, and I'm gesturing over to the right now. But you recognize that from a business perspective, or in this case, from a storyline perspective, that doesn't necessarily always work. So at the same time, you don't want to flip all the way to the other side. I'm gesturing to the left right now. So you have to find something in the middle that obviously works, that's accurate, that's true to form, but at the same time really helps develop the plot line. And so I'll say to them, look, the way it oftentimes goes is X. That won't necessarily work here. So I try to say, well, what about doing Y? And so I'll make comments as I read for the outlines or the scripts, or then I go to meetings with the showrunners and the writers and the producers and talk about these issues. And then occasionally we'll go on set, and I have been on set before, and we'll work with answer questions from the directors or the assistant directors or the producers, work with the actors. You reference being an extra. I have been thrown into two different episodes I think 301 and 401. First as a sort of a U.S. attorney at a large U.S. attorneys conference, and then second holding a Bible as the character Brian Connerty gets sworn in as U.S. attorney. So you can see me as I'm there, and I shake his hand and all that jazz. So it's been a lot of fun, but it's been a great experience in just getting to learn this industry and working with these amazing people: Brian, David, Adam Perlman, all the actors. You have phenomenal actors on the show, whether it's obviously, Paul Giamatti or Damian Lewis or Maggie Siff, David Constable, Toby Moore, Condola Rashad, my good friend Malachi Weir, who plays Lonnie, who's an amazing actor, and a host of other actors and actresses on the show. So it's been a real fantastic experience for me, and I've been really fortunate to be able to work with the show.
You started, David, by talking about how your IMDb page means nothing, but it sounds like you've got at least 2 credits on there. So I'd say a little bit more than nothing. And Kurt and I have some, questions we want to, ping off you regarding the show. But before we get into that, obviously, Billions has been in production and up into and including the pandemic. I know season 5, the episodes that were already, recorded and in production were put on hold halfway through the season. And then obviously it's been renewed for season 6. So talk to us a little bit about the change in tack that the show's taken based on the pandemic.
Well, there's certain things obviously I'm not able to talk about. I'll just say, as you saw last year, in the episodes that aired, I believe there were 7 episodes from season 5 that aired before everything shut down with the pandemic. So there's obviously another few episodes left for season 5, and then ultimately, there will be a season 6. The way these episodes are shot, and this is not just for Billions, but for other shows, TV shows as well, is you have obviously a certain number of outlines and scripts that are developed And then at a certain point, production begins. You may not have all the scripts in the can for the entire season before production begins, but then they start shooting an episode. And let's say an episode takes 2 weeks to shoot. You have a director for that, let's say episode 1. Okay, you have a director for episode 1 who's working on episode 1 before they start shooting, doing a variety of things. Then you shoot episode 1 over, let's say, 2 weeks. And then that director for episode 1 is working on everything that you do after the episode is shot, including editing and other production related things. Meanwhile, the show has now started to shoot episode 2 with a different director for that particular episode, and so on and so forth. And so there had been a number of episodes that had been shot and that were ready for release at the time they were aired last spring, but there were episodes that obviously hadn't yet aired, and the pandemic, of course, put shut everything down. So obviously Hollywood was no exception.
I can't imagine the cast of Billions filming one of those awful episodes via Zoom that we've seen in so many other TV shows. But,
not happening, right?
Yeah, we'll see. Kurt, I know we want to talk about some of the plot lines with David here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously we've been watching the show for years. There are a lot of subplots, but a through line, at least for me, is the antagonistic but evolving relationship between the character Chuck Rhodes, who is played by Paul Giamatti. In the first few seasons, he is the U.S. attorney who is pursuing Bobby Axelrod, who is played by Damian Lewis, and he, the U.S. attorney, actually gets the better of Axe a few times. Some have speculated that Chuck Rhodes' relentless pursuit of Axe for potential insider trading violations, among other things, is based on or maybe inspired by the pre-Barara Steve Cohen dynamic that played out somewhat publicly in the late 2000s and early 2010s. You don't have to tell us if that is true, David, but how much of the show is informed by real life and how much is just sort of, embellished for a television audience?
Well, I can't comment with respect to sort of your initial question, about who inspired which characters. But as I said earlier, look, the showrunners and the writers and the producers do everything in their power to try to get this right, be accurate. They know their audience. They want to be, true to form. As I sort of referenced earlier, they go to people like me and others who, have stories to tell and obviously talk about their cases. I will tell you that, in the context of what I do as, and I've been a technical advisor for seasons 2 all the way through now working on season 6 with them, that there's been more than one occasion where I've spoken with them about a particular case, and some of the fact pattern for that case is then used as part of the legal plot line. So if your question is, are there cases that are sort of reflected in some of the episodes in Billions, general matter, obviously not literally and not, every single as a general concept, the answer as a general matter is probably yes. But that's, not surprising. And that's why, whether it's Billions or any other show, are technical advisors who provide information about how things work. So, and it takes, for people who know a little bit about the world that they're dealing with that's in the show, it obviously enhances the realism for the viewer, makes it more likely that you're going to want to watch the show because it's, it's as accurate as it can be.
Yeah, and I tried to do some research ahead of our discussion today and rewatched a couple of episodes. And the phrase that stuck with me, Ari Spiros, early in the first season, is an SEC attorney, I guess. And I'm trying to remember the phrase he used. He pulls a piece of paper out, portending to show Axe trading of an inside nature, and he uses the phrase, "One of my grunts was riding the Midas." And as Kurt knows, Midas is one of our acronym bingo answers for
ding, ding, ding.
One of the data analytics programs used by the SEC. So it does sound like these investigative techniques are being well researched. I have not heard anyone on the staff refer to their colleagues as grunts before. So maybe maybe that phrase is a good indication of kind of the plot line versus the real life happening in the show.
Yeah, look, as I said, they do talk to a lot of people. And, obviously I'm one of the 2 technical advisors that they've had as a constant over the seasons. It has been in the past me, and then somebody on the finance side who obviously advises them about trading and hedge fund stuff as well as other financial issues. But in addition to getting information from me, they obviously talk to a lot of people in the industry, and they pick up a lot of the important lingo and terminology, and you see it reflected in the scripts and dialogue.
All right, so we want to talk about a specific plot line that played out in season 2, and I mean, for those listeners who have watched the show, you can't forget Ice Juice. So the Ice Juice plotline was about an IPO manipulation scheme. And at the center of the conflict, of course, were several of our main characters. In the series, Ice Juice is the hot new craze on the street. The company that makes it plans to go public. And of course, the Rhodes family gets involved, including Rhodes Sr. as one of the investors who got in on the ground floor ahead of the IPO pop. Bobby Axelrod, Axe, discovers that the Rhodes family is heavily invested and uses his connections and a bit of theater to harm the company's reputation, resulting in a poor performing IPO. Talk to us a little bit about the cat and mouse between the characters. I mean, here we're focusing on Chuck and Axe, but what elements are pulled from real life, maybe from your experiences or things you've observed?
The showrunners, the writers, they do a lot of research. Once they come up with a direction on a plot line, they really do their homework in figuring out not only the lingo, but how things work. And that plot line, obviously is no exception. And so to the extent that, there are issues that involve IPOs and how those work, and then ultimately, what's the interaction like with the SEC? And then to the extent that there's been malfeasance, what happens with the SEC investigating, and from the criminal angle, what's happening with the U.S. Attorney's Office and investigators like the FBI. And so really they want to understand sort of the dynamics and how that cat and mouse game plays out. And so there's a lot of conversations that go on, a lot of research that the writers and the writers' assistants are doing. And then obviously I get involved in a lot of phone calls and discussions and meetings and, thoughts with respect to outlines and scripts, how things would play out from sort of not only the regulatory process, right, in sort of the IPO regulatory process, but in that case, like how it would play out with the FBI investigating, what they would be doing, the kinds of techniques that they would be using, whether it's not the FBI or any other law enforcement agency, as well as what the prosecutors, the assistant U.S. attorneys might be doing to sort of develop the case and leading the investigation. And then ultimately, to the extent that they're, coordinating with other partners like the SEC or the CFTC, how that works, and then ultimately culminating in potential charges against the individuals, how the arrest might go down, what the techniques might be, and then, the eventual prosecution and how that would work in the courtroom. And as you've seen in Billions, there are, particularly with some of the earlier seasons, a number of courtroom scenes. I work with the show and what goes on with various motions and how things play out in court, and even from down to the logistics about how things work in the courtroom and where people stand and what they're doing and what they're supposed to be saying. And so, I've certainly been on set in helping out with that as well. But all that is to say that, again, it really goes back to how amazing it is to watch these guys work on the show in doing not only, the research and understanding, what's going on behind the scenes in finance and in law enforcement and prosecution, understanding how these things play out, but developing an amazing storyline every episode that is not only entertaining for the audience and intellectually stimulating, and really develops a strong arc to keep viewers engaged throughout the season, but then also adheres to sort of the legal and financial realities of what is actually happening as a general matter, to keep their viewership engaged. Sure, do sometimes they take liberties on things, of course, and that's expected because, again, it's a drama and we're talking about television. But at the same time, as I've noted throughout our discussion here, I've been so impressed with how accurate they try to keep things, and how they're so absolutely committed to the realism of the world that they revolve the show around. But it's really all about understanding how the world works and the issues that are present in these kinds of situations.
It's a little bit of an understatement to say they add some theater, especially with the vignette, Kurt, that you referenced. For those with stronger stomachs regarding ice juice, Axe, spoiler alert, has some of his colleagues and straw men poison themselves when they drink from the ice juice cauldron on the day of the IPO, therefore setting the stock down. So I don't remember reading about that in the news.
It was a fun part of that story. I mean, the whole ice juice plot was just fantastic, just because of sort of the legal nuances of it, understanding sort of the securities fraud aspects of it, so the law enforcement interplay with it, and then obviously Axe finding out about certain things, and you sort of see some of that in flashbacks, and that's a technique that's used in various episodes throughout the show, and then just sort of interweaving it with sort of the human interest parts, and then the random sort of vomiting aspects of ice juice. But yeah, no, it was a fantastic plot.
And I'm sure, David, they asked you to play one of the vomiting extras, and unfortunately, you couldn't make it into the office that day due to a client meeting or something like that. So,
yeah, well, it didn't really play over with the other extra roles that I had as a U.S. attorney. So, there you go.
That's great. And one of the things that has really struck with me in watching the show, and something that I had always known about but never conceptualized the way the show presents it, is that interplay between the agencies. We see this kind of who's going to take the case, who's going to bring the action, what order are they jockeying in together to go after Axe or to investigate Ice Juice. And so I'm going to try to rattle off all of the agencies and entities that are involved. We've got, obviously, the Southern District of New York. We also have some back and forth with the Eastern District of New York, Main Justice here in Washington, the Department of Justice here in D.C., the SEC, obviously, the New York Attorney General's office. And I've got to give a shout out as a native of Western New York, Buffalo Bob, again, spoiler alert, is propped up and put in as governor at some point during the third or fourth season. So we've got the governor's office involved as well. And that soup of all of those groups working together or in conflict really adds another layer to the show. And David, as we talked about up front with your background, you've served with some of those groups, not only those with interesting nicknames. Do we see that kind of conflict playing out, or that coordination playing out between the agencies in practice?
Absolutely. That was something that I noticed very early on in my experience with the show, that they were very interested in learning about the dynamics among the different offices within the Department of Justice, the interaction between the Department of Justice and other agencies, and then the interaction between federal and state law enforcement agencies. And so you see that sort of played out, like most notably, and for those who are in New York and know sort of the New York law enforcement community or know U.S. attorneys' offices, know that there is let's just say, a healthy level of competition between the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. And that rivalry is depicted quite well in the show. And of course, it's something that, the showrunners and the writers were interested in, learned about, asked about, and is incorporated, obviously, in some of the earlier seasons. There's also interesting dynamics between the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District with Main Justice in Washington. And frankly, that also reflects reality, that there's always interesting dynamics between Main Justice and U.S. Attorney's Office sections, but there's much more coordination, as a general matter in the real world, between most U.S. Attorney's Office and Main Justice versus the Southern District of New York and Main Justice. And that also is, I think, depicted well in the show. And as you sort of noted, there's other agencies like the SEC, and there's, some depiction of the parallel investigations that often go on between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Commission. And then, you mentioned the New York Attorney General's office. For those who have certainly seen some of the later seasons that have aired already, that the show is focused more away from the U.S. Attorney's Office onto the New York Attorney General's office. And so that's become a real focus of the show, obviously, for those of you who've seen the later shows. And if not, and you don't want to know what I'm about to say, then, certainly pause me right now. Of course, Chuck becomes the Attorney General for the state of New York. And that's, I think people have seen season 4, that, and even for the episodes that have aired in season 5. And so there's a depiction of what goes on in the New York AG's office. And again, I think as I've mentioned throughout our conversation today, the show wants to get this stuff as accurate as possible. And so they've learned about the AG's office and spoken with people and spoken with me. I've had a lot of experience in dealing with the AG's office. And so, again, there's a lot of agencies that are depicted, both those federal and state agencies and others that are depicted. And they try, again, to be as accurate as possible in showing the dynamics between those agencies and how they play out in very complex and interesting cases.
I think perhaps we've saved the best question for last year. I'm not sure how it took this long, but we have to talk about Orrin Bach, the big law defense attorney played by Glenn Fleshler, who represents Bobby Axelrod, AXCAP, and several of the employees at AXCAP, including in season 4, he represented Wendy Rhodes, who's played by Maggie Siff. As you would expect, the defense lawyer plays a critical role in the story. Bach's character has been in 32 episodes, and I'm sure David will agree with me that he really is the reluctant hero that the show is centered around.
Classic take from Kurt.
All this other stuff is really just noise, right? This is a show about an SEC enforcement defense lawyer.
Yeah, right.
He's been in some really pivotal, some really interesting scenes. He seems to bump into U.S. Attorney Brian Connerty in strange places like pizza parlors and barbershops and bathrooms throughout. And those are always entertaining scenes. But I'm wondering, David, how much influence do you have on the shape of this character, and who are they writing? How much are we sort of tweaking this to get the flavor of what it is actually like to be defense counsel on some of these matters?
Well, look, I don't think that I had any specific influence on that character, but I will tell you, like I said before, they certainly have asked me questions about, particular cases or how, you defend this kind of situation or that kind of situation. And again, a number of the people that work on the show are actually lawyers, and a couple of whom used to practice. And so there's some level of familiarity there. But also, like I said, they do ask questions of me and other practitioners in both the criminal defense sphere as well as the civil securities enforcement sphere on how you handle certain situations. And so, there's a certain level of familiarity they have as a result of those conversations and developing characters as a general matter. Bach is just a special character to begin with, so Orrin is sort of almost like an in-house counsel for AXE, if you will, and but dealing with a variety of issues. And so I don't think that there's any one person that Orrin Bach is modeled on, but I think certainly a lot of what that character faces from a criminal defense standpoint and a securities enforcement standpoint are sometimes issues that we regular practitioners in real life have to deal with. There's obviously some things that we don't have to deal with, as you pointed out, like, sort of surprise meetings with Assistant U.S. Attorney and then U.S. Attorney Brian Connerty in pizza parlors and bathrooms. When it comes to Orrin Bach, that, of course, they have to portray him a certain way from a Hollywood perspective, but they also need him to, sort of be doing certain things that are more typical of what a criminal defense lawyer might do. Like, when there's conversations and Orrin's like, listen, I'm going to leave the room now, or whatever it might be. Yeah, that's obviously more Hollywoodified, right? But it's a recognition that lawyers can't necessarily be involved in certain conversations. But again, obviously that's a fantastic character, and it's like the perfect character to represent AXE. And it's sort of a wonderful dichotomy when you have like AXE and Orrin on one side, right? And then you have WAGs on the other. So it just works. The whole thing just works.
Yeah, I agree completely. I love it.
Reluctant hero leaving the room to avoid a discrediting conversation. I don't know, Kurt. We're going to have to talk about that offline.
All right, Chris. You know what time it is. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, we're going to start our lightning round, David. So we have, for our listeners out there, we've prepared a list of billions-related either-or questions that David has not been privy to. So we're looking for your gut check answer on some of these. So we'll explore any shocking answers immediately after you respond. But Kurt, why don't you kick it off?
All right. Here we go. Lightning round. Question number 1. David, you get to appoint the next U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. You need a hard-nosed prosecutor who will get the job done.
Chuck Rhodes. Sorry, go ahead.
Hold on. I didn't even give you the choices here. Who do you pick, Chuck or Jock?
Oh, interesting. I'm going to probably say Chuck, just because from the early days, when Chuck was U.S. Attorney in the earlier seasons, I felt such a kinship to the office that I had to be Team Chuck. Inevitably, there's a Team Chuck and a Team Axe that developed throughout the seasons, and obviously Jock as Attorney General was a special kind of AG, but he was no sort of gritty, bare knuckle brawler fighter like Chuck Rhodes. So I'm going to go with Chuck.
That's probably the consensus answer. But let's kick off question number 2. David, you have to pick someone to lead the Southern District's famous Securities and Commodities Fraud Task Force. Who do you think has the right stuff? The staunch idealist in Brian Connerty or the tireless pragmatist in Kate Sacker?
That's a really hard question, especially since both characters evolve over the seasons, as you all have seen. And obviously we all know what happened at the end of season 4, and with good old Brian Connerty in handcuffs. So I would say I was kind of more with the idealistic Brian Connerty in his early days, but then as he took a turn for the worse, then certainly Kate Sacker seems like the most obvious choice. Although she was, for a period, chief of the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office under Chuck Rhodes. But in the early days, I would say the Brian Connerty character. I will tell you, it has been fantastic working, as I noted earlier, with all of these actors, and just talking about the U.S. Attorney actors, from the earlier seasons, namely Paul Giamatti and Toby Moore and Condola Rashad and Malachi Weir plays Lonnie. They're all unbelievable actors, and they were all very interested in trying to get the characters right. And I've joked quite a bit with Toby Moore plays Brian Connerty, as well as Malachi Weir plays Lonnie, on how their characters sort of evolved and became much more Chuck-like than the idealistic AUSAs that they started out as. I did note that I think all my friends who might be listening to this and former SDNY AUSAs would all say that they stayed like the true Brian Connerty and never went over to the dark side. But nevertheless, that's my answer.
All right. Well, as we've mentioned, you have been on both sides of the table, and you're now back in private practice. One of the characters I think we mentioned in passing earlier was Ari Spiros, who was over at the SEC on the show. Of course, we also have Oren Bach, who is the big law defense attorney. So now that you've been on both sides, what's more your style, David? Are you Oren Bach or Ari Spiros?
Wow, is that my only choice? Yeah, well, I guess I'm going to go with neither. But at the same time, I do admire a lot of the qualities that Oren Bach has as a defense lawyer, a zealous advocate and whatnot. Spiros, particularly in the later seasons, as he works at Axe Cap as chief compliance officer, can make a hell of a cup of coffee and has tremendous wit. But I'm not sure he's as respected within the Axe organization. I love the Ari Spiros character. I think that's a great character. And I enjoyed his character when he was working at the SEC, very sort of, standing up a little bit to the Southern District. Although that relationship in of itself, was interesting, an interesting dynamic. I will say, as a general matter, the Southern District and the SEC New York regional office, as well as the CFTC New York office, work hand in hand and very well and very closely together, particularly obviously on securities and commodities fraud cases. But Spiros's character was amazing. I can't say that I would consider myself to be akin to either one of them, but I certainly appreciate the qualities and characteristics of both. How's that for an objective answer?
Appropriately hedged.
Yeah, I don't know if either or really applies, but
No, sorry. I don't think I answered that question directly.
David, next question. You're moving into a role leading a hedge fund, and you need to stand up a new fund underneath that with a portfolio manager. If you had your choice, who would you pick? The quant savant in Taylor Mason, or Dollar Bill Stern, the cheapest man on Wall Street?
Oh my God, these are hard questions. It's funny. Well, first of all, I love Dollar Bill's character, right? Like, who does not like Dollar Bill? What a great character. Kelly O'Coin is an amazing actor, of course, and it's just amazing to watch that role. I think, though, in truth, I think that there certainly were some hedge funds. Particularly when I was at the Southern District and we were investigating hedge funds for insider trading, there were a lot of characters that were like Dollar Bill, right? I do think that now there are a lot of hedge funds that are more focused on complex financial products and other instruments, including cryptocurrency, that probably do better with a Taylor character than a Dollar Bill character and the quant and the algo focus. And so, assuming that we're not talking about the need for really aggressive folks who are going to go out and find the information and get it, to quote Wall Street, I probably at this point think that some hedge funds are looking more to sort of the Taylor Mason kind of character from the quant algo perspective for highly complex financial products. But there's always going to be a place for a Dollar Bill.
There's that old school to new school comparison that they're representing there. That's great.
Absolutely right. Okay, we got just a couple more for you here, David. Bear with us.
All right.
Spoiler alert. One of the recurring themes in Billions is this sort of tension or conflict between, let's say, morality and legality, and where you sort of draw that line. Let's say that, again, you're running a hedge fund, David. Are you looking for alpha or black edge?
It's a really good question. And I think it goes a little bit to your last question, right? Look, I think there's a need for both. And, especially nowadays with, there's just obviously so many hedge funds out there. There's so many people trying to get that small edge that, you need kind of a combination of folks, who are really out there and aggressively trying to gather the information and make it happen, as well as the quant folks who are doing what they need to do in trying to get, this little bit of an edge. But, look, I want to make clear, I think most of the professionals that are out there are doing, things legally and doing what they need to be doing the right thing. Have there been people at hedge funds who have broken the law and traded on inside information? Well, of course. That's why there's the show Billions, right? And that's, that was a key priority and focus of the U.S. Attorney's Office, particularly starting around 2008, 2009-ish at the Southern District, going obviously through the present, but particularly for the 5-6 years after that point. And so, I think there's obviously been a focus on insider information and sort of, dirty money and the focus by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC on hedge funds, and appropriately so, given what happened, particularly over the last decade and to 15 years. And so, look, I think that, hedge funds by and large are doing things on the up and up and trying, obviously, to maximize value for their investors. But you certainly need a combination of people who are aggressive, but also quantitatively focused.
Final question for you, David. Imagining a world where you have not had a great week at the office. You're down on your luck. You've had huge losses. Axe is mad at you. You're looking to one of the other folks in your office to put you back on your feet. Do you turn to the individual who will help you intrinsically, or do you go for the guy who's going to support you hedonistically? Are you looking to reach out to Wendy to support your mental state and get you back in the ready, or are you going to party with Wags at the end of the week?
That's a real tough choice because I don't think you could ever say no to partying with Wags. Full stop.
That's it.
But I think there is actually tremendous value in what Wendy does, for Axe and for the people at Axe Capital. Everybody needs to be facing their inner demons. And Wendy obviously is a very important and critical cog in the wheel at Axe Capital and keeps people going, keeps people focused on what they're doing. So I think you go to Wendy, but there's no question that at the end of the week, you leave some time to party with Wags.
I love it.
I love it. Yep.
Awesome. Well, David, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for talking us through some of the nuance in how you approach your role as the technical advisor to billions, as well as a full-time gig, representing, folks in the white-collar world, as well as helping build a practice at Greenberg Traurig. So we really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kurt. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. You guys have a great show. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Insecurities Podcast, and a special thanks to our guest, David Miller of Greenberg Traurig. As always, we want to hear from you regarding your thoughts, comments, and topics for discussion on future episodes of Insecurities. Please use the hashtag InsecuritiesPod on Twitter or LinkedIn to join the conversation. You can find me at EcomoffCPA.
And I'm at Enforce_update.
Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the Insecurities Podcast wherever you listen. Be well, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Insecurities, a podcast from PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is a nonprofit provider of authoritative professional services training and continuing education. In an increasingly complex business environment where intricate corporate structures reign, Insecurities can help you make sense of it all. A special thanks goes to the producer of Insecurities, Daniel Peinitz, as well as hosts Chris Ecomoff and Kurt Wolf. For more information about PLI's SEC Institute, or to view hundreds of hours of fresh and relevant on-demand programming covering changes within the securities sector, visit pli.edu/membership and sign up for a privileged membership. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal, audit, tax, consulting, business, financial, investment, or other professional advice, and it does not create an attorney-client relationship. Please consult a qualified professional advisor before taking any action based on the information herein. Furthermore, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. PLI, Troutman Pepper, and RSM do not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission from PLI.